Well, my name is James Thomas, and I work at Maastricht University, and I've been working at Maastricht University for almost 20 years. My life at Maastricht University started at the pedagogical faculty, or the Faculty of Education, where I was just working as a teacher trainer and some English language courses. And then I had 6 very important years at the Faculty of Informatics. And after that, I came to the Department of English and American Studies, where I am now, and where I work as the head of teacher training. In teacher training, the focus of my work is on the language aspect of it. Many people who work in teacher training are involved in methodological issues, but my work is mainly focused on the language itself. And what particularly interests me in the teaching of language is a guided discovery approach. And it was through the guided discovery approach that I became particularly interested in the use of corpora, because they permit students to have a look at language and draw their own conclusions. So with the teacher's help, they can arrive at their own conclusions. So it was in the process of this that I created this book, which I'm going to talk a bit about today. Well, I had no knowledge of language as data until once I was in a bookshop in Berlin reading the introduction to a dictionary, where I saw a reference to frequency statistics. And this really piqued my interest. A few years later, when I arrived in Brno, I met a woman called Bohumila Koželohova, and she was particularly interested in the teaching of Czech as a foreign language. And through her, I met Karel Palla, who was working in computational linguistics at the Faculty of Arts at Maastricht University. And it was through Karel showing me many things that could be done with computers and language that my interest in this really took off. Some years later, I was working at the Faculty of Education, and we had access to various tools for using corpora, and so I started exploring them then. One of the interesting things we had was the Micro Concord program of Tim Johns, who is one of the leaders in using corpora in language education, or I should say was. He died some years ago, but he made amazing progress. So during my time then at Faculty of Informatics, I was working under Karel Palla, and in his department was Pavel Rychlý, and he was working on a program called Bonito, which later became Sketch Engine. And then he met Adam Kilgariev, and together they turned Sketch Engine into what it is today. We also had online at that time the co-build online Corpus sampler, and we were able to do a lot of work with that. That was very interesting. And unfortunately, that was taken offline only about 5 years ago. But in the meantime, Sketch Engine has developed a program called Skell, which is replacing it very nicely, and I'll mention that later. And while I was using the co-build Corpus sampler, I created a website which became very popular, used by a lot of people. But in the process of creating it, I realized all sorts of things that were going to be important for using corpora in language education. And the most important of them was, you've got to have a question. And that's what my book is very much based on, having a question. I'd been preparing worksheets for many years for students in various situations. And once I got a phone call from the pedagogical faculty asking me if I would give a workshop to their linguists on using Sketch Engine. And part of the requirement of that appointment was that I produce a bunch of worksheets. So I bundled them together, and in the process I thought that this could become a book. So it's quite simply from that starting point that the idea for a book grew. And then when I mentioned the idea to Adam Kilgariev, who was then the owner of Sketch Engine, he was very supportive, and the book went from strength to strength. I think one of the reasons why this book is necessary is simply that there is no other book like it in the world, which is a bit worrying. Maybe if there is no book like it, there's no need for it, but we shall see. It was only published a few months ago. But one of the things that the book does is it extends this idea of you've got to have a question, takes it further, and it asks students to consider very strongly language as patterns rather than rules. And this is very much in keeping with Neo-Firthian linguists, which has dominated the second half of British linguists in the 20th century. First and foremost, this is actually not a book about corpus linguistics. What it does is it trains people to use corpora and the software that's required to investigate corpora in depth, in a way that no other book does. And the format of the book is asking questions, all sorts of questions about language at all levels of the hierarchy of language, as well as stylistics and pragmatics, and showing students how to derive answers from the data they get when they perform the search. And this is quite important because there are many things that Corpora can offer us, and Sketch Engine software in particular allows us to do many things which other software doesn't. But at the moment, there is no book that takes people through the software, teaching them what they can learn about language from it. What we have to also do, and what the book does, is it emphasizes the idea of converting data into information. Because when you do a search, all you get is a bunch of bits of tidbits, really. And until they're structured, they're not really information. And this is something I emphasize quite a lot in the book, converting data into information. I think the other things that the students will get is an understanding of the British linguistics, which has informed the lexical approach, which has had quite a big impact on language teaching resources at the end of the 20th century. And much of that work was done based on corpus analysis. I hope that my teacher trainees who work through my book develop a sense for corpora in the way that it intends, and that in their teaching they will develop the next generation of language learners and perhaps even future teachers in these ways. And I think that is one of the biggest things that we have to do to get people using corpora, is the teacher training has to focus on it. If we don't, it won't. As I mentioned earlier, there's a program called SKEL, which Sketch Engine has brought out, and it's called Sketch Engine for Language Learning. And it has a much simpler interface and is rather similar to the COBOL Corpus Sampler I mentioned earlier, but in a much more 21st century way. I think that SKEL offers us something quite useful for language learning, and that students who are non-linguists will be able to approach corpora if they're guided to do so by their teachers. Well, at the moment I'm working on a new type of dictionary. It's an experimental stage at the moment, but it does something a little bit unconventional in terms of dictionaries for learners these days. It does actually take into account the learner's first language. So that's in its early stages at the moment. And it's inevitable that I will have to produce a new edition of the book, Desky, because Sketch Engine itself is being updated almost daily by the team of programmers, so the book needs to keep pace with the developments in the software. And this is one of the reasons why I chose to publish the book as a print-on-demand, self-published book, because no commercial publisher would ever bring out a new edition once a year of any book. I just say Desky.